Um, Firstly, well done for making it to 4 o'clock to listen to someone from Stoke talk rubbish. What we're going to just go through with you is our kind of journey through transforming our front end of our waste service in partnership with Bartek and Jadu. You will all know that waste is a pretty controversial subject in local government. People get very passionate about their bins, don't they? So we needed to do something about that. Our waste team had got no online presence. We forced everybody down a voice route, so they had to ring up and contact us about any bin issues via the phone. So that resulted in nearly 18,000 calls logged last year just about bins. That took on average 6.5 minutes, nearly 7 minutes to answer. So a significant amount of our contact centre time on fairly low complexity demands. So we've got over 285,000 bins in Stoke across 116,000 properties. So as I say, a significant issue and one that we needed to crack in order to start to make a dent into our digital strategy. So we had a look at how those demands were playing out. So obviously missed bins is the sexy one, isn't it? That's the one everyone gets excited about. So over 7,000 missed bin calls. But the interesting thing for us was that actually less than half of those resulted in us logging a job for a missed collection. So nearly sort of 55% of those calls were waste, if you'll excuse the pun. There was no value added from those calls. So we needed to act, but we didn't just want to stick an e-form on the website and just open the floodgates to 7,000 people logging missed bin calls. I should say also there was another driver in that we had to get off our legacy CRM system, which we did at the end of last month. So that created a bit of a sort of time pressure on that one as well. So we had a series of objectives. There'll not be kind of anything there that's particularly controversial to you, but key ones were around automation, and that's where we got a huge amount of support from Bartek around actually what do we do with that demand once it's pushed from CXM or XFP into Bartek Collective. As I said, they're low complexity. There was no reason for a huge amount of manual handling of those approaches, of those service requests. Sorry. We wanted to reduce avoidable contact. Coming back to that missed bin thing, it was a similar theme that was replicated across all of our waste service requests, was that a significant amount of them resulted in no real value demands being logged. We wanted to draw on expert skills and knowledge only when required. So waste was a big favourite amongst our contact centre operatives, but they had to be trained on waste, and we needed to remove that as a pressure, because actually there's nothing that difficult about logging a waste request. So how could we make those forms, both public and back office, so simple that you didn't need to be trained on waste or trained on Bartek in order to complete them? And clearly it supported our strategy of getting 24/7 access to services via our website and the My Stoke account. So we looked at all of these really interesting waste demands. Little did I know there was so much to waste when I set out on this service review. In my simple head, you got a bin, it got emptied. Sometimes it didn't. You rang up, you'd maybe ask for a new one. Turns out I was very naive. Our waste processes were amongst the most convoluted and complicated that we've come across across all the services, really. Very niche Stoke rules on what we will allow and when and why, which we had to challenge throughout the process. What we wanted to do as part of the review, though, was present up more information to the customer via the website and via the My Stoke account. So we've got the bin day widget on the website, which is built into the user journey around missed bins, or will be. So actually, we don't want people logging demands that aren't genuine. So we've built in the bin day widget. So enter in your postcode and your property number, and it will tell you when your next bin collection is. So very, very simple, but actually, as Bartek have seen a reduction in around 30% of demands, I think, at some authorities, just by putting that on the website. And we went a step further and we built a widget for the My Account, which will pull through the property data automatically. So it will tell you as soon as you log into your My Stoke account that your next bin collection is next Tuesday, and it's a brown bin. The design here was it was important, as I said, that we didn't want to just stick an online form onto the front end of a broken process. We wanted full two-way integration between Jadu and Bartek, and that's what we've just about achieved. So what our solution looks like is a little bit like that. So we've got an X form which will look up into Bartek round details, features, so what bins you've got at your property, what attributes are linked to your property, any street events or premise events that have been logged against that property. So if a bin man, I don't think I'm allowed to call them a bin man anymore, but they mostly are in Stoke. So if a bin crew logs a street event against your property, let's say snow or parked cars or a police incident, which means that they couldn't empty your bin, we wanted to be able to present that information up to the customer to say, actually, don't bother because we're coming back tomorrow. You don't need to tell us that we've missed your bin. And similarly, we didn't want somebody to be able to order a bin that they weren't entitled to. So, if we will look up in the X form from Bartek what the round is. So if it's a recycling round, we will let somebody order recycling bins. If it's not a recycling round, we won't present that up as an option for you to order a recycling bin. So and in doing that, what we can do then is automate the back end process. So we don't need any human validation of that request when it goes into Bartek. We can make an assumption that that's right, and we will pass that straight through to the bin crews to then deliver the bin or carry out the miscollection. So we've achieved quite a lot of high levels of automation through doing that. So we will pull all of that into the X form, and using the conditional logics within X forms, we will branch that form and show different messages to the customer based on what we've pulled out of Bartek, so that they can understand what the process looks like. If we actually allow a form to go into Bartek, we'll obviously integrate into CXM as well, so that the customer then gets that full case update. And then from the back of that, we'll push information back out of Bartek once we've completed that service request, push it back into CXM to update the customer to say we've now collected your bin, or we've delivered your bin, or we've repaired your bin lid, or whatever the situation might be. And that's all done based on what the bin crews do in cab. So they will be driving around, collect the missed bin, update the status in collective, and that will pass straight through into CXM, which we've then got rules in CXM to transition the case and deliver a status update to the customer. So they're getting that full end-to-end, closing the loop so that the customer is updated throughout the process. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on missed bin, because as I say, that's the one we all love, isn't it? So our X form for missed bins does 4 main checks, and it's only after it passes those 4 checks that we will actually create a case or create a service request in Bartek. So we'll check if it's after 5 p.m. on the day of the collection. I've never seen a bin crew out at 5 to 5, I'll be honest, but they're the rules. Was a collection due at the address within the past 2 days? So we're quite harsh on that, really. But if you weren't due a collection, you can't log a missed bin. Is there a street event against the property? So again, has there been a parked car or something that's prevented access, or bad weather meant that the crews couldn't get to the address? If they all fail, we will reject the service request and we'll display a message to the customer telling them why it's failed and why they can't log that request. And then the final check is if there's a premise event against the property. So have the bin crews logged against that UPRN that the bin was not presented. So they didn't leave the bin out, so we couldn't collect it. So it's not missed. So again, if it passes that, then we create the service request, we pass it into Bartek Collective, and it goes straight into a missed bin work pack for a bin crew to go out and collect. So there's no human handling of that case at all. It goes straight from customer logging it into the bin crew's work pack, and they will then go out and collect the bin, hopefully this time round. So you can just about see there on the screen, we've got the bottom screenshot there shows you one of the sort of tailored confirmation pages that we will show on the X form, depending on what we pull back from Collective. So that one's showing that there was no collection due over the last 2 days. But if it was that it had failed because the bin was not presented, we would show a different message at that point to show that you can't log a missed bin. Here's what you can do with your waste instead. Got to say, this is a really painful process, and that's not a criticism of Jadu or Bartek, who have both been brilliant in supporting us to get to this point. There was a lot of learning to come out of it. We, as I say, perhaps went into it a little bit naively, thinking that, well, I certainly did, thinking that, well, bins is easy. And it turns out it really isn't. As I learned early on when I listened to a few calls from our contact centre and sort of heard the passion that customers can display over a missed bin. Who knew that was all we did as a council, but turns out it is. Engage the experts early on. We had really great support from Bartek. We had a great project manager who we got on site a number of times to do workshops with the team and with ourselves so that we could understand the art of the possible in terms of what we can automate and what we can't in Bartek. The big learning there is you're only as good as the data in Bartek Collective. So if the bin crews don't update their in-cab technology, if they don't update the event against the premise or the street, then we're at their mercy, really. The beauty of that is if they don't log a bin not presented, then they're going to end up having to go back and collect it. So we've tried to almost sell that as one of the ways of getting them to use Bartek properly, because if you don't, you can end up doing more missed bin collections. But what we found is, and we implemented Bartek around about 2 to 3 years ago, that it had been implemented with our waste team in mind, really. So the data in there was patchy at times because we didn't know necessarily what bins we'd got at what properties when it had gone into Bartek. So there's a whole host of sort of holding features in properties where it could be a Res 240 or it could be something, it could be a 360 litre bin, we don't really know. And because it didn't matter at that point, it was just a bin that the crews needed to collect. It didn't matter what size it was, but now it does matter. So we've had to do quite a bit of work in terms of cleansing that, and that's ongoing. Automation, obviously, you're all here because you want to automate things, so I don't need to labour that point, but we've automated a lot of processes that previously we had a lot of kind of kickback on. So we were challenged throughout, really, on things, on needing to verify things, and I couldn't get my head around that. This is a bin, what's the risk here? Why is somebody going to fraudulently claim an assisted collection? What's in it for them, really? But we had to challenge that with the service area a lot, and eventually, through kind of presenting them with arguments around the data, they would give in, or I'd make them. Usually the latter. Know your processes and business rules. That's quite hard for as a change team for us to do. And actually what we found was that it was quite hard for the waste team to do as well. They didn't always know their business rules. Sometimes they were quite reactive and ad hoc. So all of a sudden somebody puts a barbecue in a bin that's a bit too hot and it sets fire to it, and we've got a whole policy then around we charge for people who've burnt their bins down, just off the back of one person. And we had to sort of challenge that to say, you can't do that because it breaks our forms and it breaks our processes and it's illogical. So we're continuing to sort of challenge those as they come up. And we've had to consider the differing training needs, and it comes back to that responsibility that we're now placing on the bin crews themselves to update Bartek correctly, because without that, the process fails. So that was, again, something that I perhaps didn't factor in at the start of the process. In my head, they were just using Bartek as they should use it. But it turned out that actually we needed to change their mindset, that they were delivering a customer service in effect, and what they put into that system, what they put into their in-cab, would potentially be shown to a customer at the other end. So there was a real need to upskill those in terms of using Bartek Collective correctly. Outcomes. In terms of tangible outcomes, it's too early for me to give you any kind of data on this, because we've been sort of going live with these forms over the last month. So we haven't really got anything to say we've reduced call demand by X amount or whatever at this point. What we have got is an improved customer experience. Customers can log whenever they want. So, and they're getting that status update. It's a consistent experience now, regardless of the access point. So our contact center are using the exact same forms as the back office. They're not checking the back end system anymore. They will use the same logics to come to the same conclusions that the form will. So there's no advantage of going online or ringing up. You'll get exactly the same service, which in turn has simplified the process for contact center staff. So we don't need to waste train staff anymore. They don't need to be trained as a specialist in waste. The form does all the training for them. It removes all the scripting, which obviously has massive benefits for our contact center team in terms of resilience. We have got improved use of Bartek Collective now, so we are starting to cleanse that data because we've got to. Otherwise, as I say, that the processes break. So yeah, and that's essentially where we are. What we've also done in the big image is a widget that we've placed on one of our homepages, on our waste homepage, which shows all of the street events that have been logged today. So again, trying to stop people from logging stuff that they don't need to, trying to stop them entering the form when they don't need to. That widget at the bottom of that laptop there pulls that data from Bartek. So if there's been something, I don't know, it's probably in the winter, it'll be a long list of where there's been snow or no access because of bad weather. They will all show automatically on that widget, and we're trying to build that into the customer journey. And we're also trying to work with our comms team to push that out. So when we're getting messages on Facebook and we're getting tweets about why haven't you emptied the bins on X road today, our comms team and our social media team can easily signpost towards that, and they haven't got to get engaged in a big lengthy debate about why we haven't done it or whatever. What we want to try and do as a next phase is to build that into the My account and actually start pulling through premise events linked to a UPRN. So actually, if we know your address, why can't we show you in your My account that your bin has been emptied, or your bin wasn't presented, or it wasn't, or it was contaminated, or whatever it might be. So that's the next step for that in terms of the My account and adding to that bin day widget that we've got in there. Yeah, that's where we are in terms of our waste project. Massive thanks to Tim and his team at Bartek for all the work they've done at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was amazing.